I'm Corey, and this is the Hardcore Skeptic Examines. Hey folks, and welcome to the Hardcore Skeptic Examines, the podcast that takes a very long look at a particular subject through a series of interviews and commentary. This is the 12th episode in the first season of this show, and the subject is social justice. So I feel the need to mention a couple things before this episode. First, this was back in early April of this year, 2017. Regular listeners will know that, but for anyone new to the podcast, you should know that if there's a current event or something that isn't covered by my series of questions, it's because of the timing. If you want an explanation about why all my interviews were done in March and April, you can just go into the back catalog and the explanation is there. So as for current events, I want to touch on something. There was a conference the weekend of September 30th, 2017. There was some talk of a tweet from Carl, or Sargon of Akkad, where he tweeted that he wouldn't even rape a sexual assault survivor. Dr. Winters and I talk about this a little bit in the episode. So, just from my perspective, this is obviously not an okay thing to tweet to anyone, but when confronted at the conference, he smugly confirmed that he had done this and received applause from many of the people in the crowd. There's a video circulating where you can see it. This has raised concerns by many about the kind of community that we're creating for atheists and skeptics, and whether women can feel welcome or safe. I'll mention it after the interview, but I have a team of great people working on our next conference here in Saskatchewan, and we're very much focusing on this aspect of the community. We really want to be welcoming to people of color, women, and members of marginalized groups, and we want everyone to feel as safe as they can and as welcome as they can. And we want everybody to be cool and enjoy going to atheist and skeptic conferences. So I mentioned before that Kristi mentioned the tweet in this talk we had. We don't spend a lot of time on it other than to just mention that people like Carl are the reason that feminism is still very important. This is something that I've felt for a while, and I think it bears repeating many times over. So with that said, I want to kind of just say, let's keep moving forward. Recognize that while there are plenty of anti-feminist or anti-SJWs, they are not necessarily the norm, and while they do seem very loud and prevalent in our community right now, they are not the standard. And we can still repair this community and our relationships with each other if we keep pushing forward. So with that said, you can kind of tell where my thoughts lie in relation to feminism and social justice. So despite a reputation I seem to be getting, I think that I'm definitely not true neutral on the subject. But I don't think that takes away from this interview. Kristi was an awesome guest, and for the near hour that we spoke, it flew by. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. For the interest of whoever happens to listen to this, why don't you introduce yourself and give us a bit of your background?
Sure. I'm Kristi Winters. I have a PhD in government where my emphasis was examining political behavior, paying attention to the differences and similarities based on sex and gender. I am a social scientist. I run the qualitative election study of Britain, so I have both a quants and a qual background, and I see both perspectives, and I can kind of wear both hats and see how the methods can map onto each other, and also where they're very unique and can tell us different things. And I'm a politics geek. And that's pretty much the core of, most of at least my activity on YouTube. I mean, I have a personal life, but when it comes to talking about the things I care about, it's kind of along that nexus of social justice and progressive values, academia, the scientific method and rigor in our thought, and politics. So.
Very cool. So, in your estimation, or how would you define social justice?
Well, I think there's obviously two parts to the word. And a lot of times we tend to focus more on the justice side of it. And what is justice? How do we achieve justice? What are the means by which we should go about working toward justice? I don't think justice itself is a very controversial word. Actually, where the controversy comes is in the social part of it. Because when people hear the word social, they kind of maybe think of society and pass over it. But from an academic point of view, the social, if we wanted to give it more of a noun sense of the word rather than as an adjective for justice, is every part of our lives. The economics is social. Politics is social. What happens in our private lives, and how we, talk about like domestic abuse, right? Those things used to be private. Now they're public. So there are social issues that move into the private sphere. Religion or lack of spirituality is a social activity. And so when I hear the word social justice, what I mean is that a person gets up in the morning, they go about their day, and they experience the maximal amount of liberty and dignity that they can until they go to bed. And everyone has a similar experience. And that's maybe a utopian goal because we're human beings and we have evolutionary instincts and cognitive biases that are hardwired into our brains. But we also are able to reason. And it's always been by appealing to both our humanity and our reason, in my view, that we've been able to move forward as a society.
Fair enough. So how do you think different groups fit into that broader social justice, like a Black Lives Matter or feminist organizations?
Sure. So what justice is contested. Justice is an abstract concept, and it's underpinned by values. And so what you value will influence what you think is just. And this is what we debate in our societies, especially in democratic societies. Right. And so when you have a multiplicity, a myriad of different views of justice, then everyone is going to be articulating their view, or they're going to be finding voices that they share common views with, right? And then organize and make their cases. And so a group like Black Lives Matter, if you look at their political agenda, rather than focusing on the extreme instances of people associated with the group,
right,
like demilitarizing the police. I, as an American citizen, am very concerned about the idea of military equipment from the Middle East being decommissioned because the war we're moving out, being put onto the streets of America.
Yeah.
And the kinds of weapons and body armor. This escalates things. And so I find it very troubling. So I agree with them. When Black Lives Matter talks about having independent commissions to review police shootings, to make sure that they don't happen inside the police departments where the people who are accused of shooting, are working and all their friends are there. I agree with that. So if anyone wants to go down the policy platforms of Black Lives Matter and tell me where they disagree, let's have that conversation.
Right.
But if you are focusing on extreme outliers or bad actors, that means you don't have to talk about the demilitarization of the police. So I think that it's, how you have those conversations is very important.
Right. Yeah, it does seem to be where the majority of the criticism that I've seen or heard about Black Lives Matter is about, well, in this instance, this person did this thing, and they're a leader in the group, therefore the group is a bad group type thing.
Right. We would call that a guilt by association fallacy or a fallacy of composition.
Right.
You're taking one person in one instance and saying they're all like this. And that's just not the case. And of course the counter of Black Lives Matter is all lives matter.
Right.
And yet recently there's been a lot of focus in DC about some brown and Black girls who've gone missing, and they had a community meeting about these missing girls. And someone took a picture of a room filled with brown and Black people. And the tweet asked, "Where was all lives matter tonight?"
Right. Yeah. It seems like all lives matter isn't it, like you say, like it's almost a reaction, not a true value position.
Right. Because, if this was tied to the idea of the things like demilitarizing the police and having body cams on police so that we can see incidents not from descriptions but from the video, then they would have more credibility. But what I instead hear is it's an attempt to silence people,
right,
and keep everything the same, not actually change the problems that are causing people to say, hey, you know what, Black Lives Matter too. So
yeah, it's interesting to think about, like, people who criticize Black Lives Matter haven't actually discussed their platform policies their policies very much, like the things that they're actually advocating for.
Right.
I wonder.
I know.
I wonder how. I might have to ask the next person who has issues with Black Lives Matter how they feel about some of their policy issues.
Yeah, and how many can they name?
Yeah. Seems like a fair question.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one of the things that a lot of people have said is that all this focus on individual groups is actually causing more division than it is helping bring people together. What do you think of that?
That sounds like a great argument for the status quo.
Right.
You know, if you want to say, look, the more you talk about the fact that you're oppressed, the more I get angry at you for complaining about being oppressed. So the way we solve your oppression is to actually you keep being oppressed, but stop talking about it. And I don't know when that's ever worked as a movement for emancipation or liberation. I can't think of an instance in history where people were just handed power or rights or dignity by a group that was denying them that without them doing anything for it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, let's just be honest about all political movements, though. If you look at the history of political movements in democracies, people on let's take the left, the suffragettes, right? Back in the first wave of feminism, when women were agitating for basic rights, like marital property rights and the right to vote and the right to be a legal citizen separate from their husbands, to have custody of their kids, these kinds of basic things in terms of, their rights vis-a-vis the states. There were a group of women who rejected violent means. They rejected things that would be shocking. They thought that they should be moderate. And then there were the more extremists, the more radical feminists. Those were the women who were chaining themselves to fences, who were, when they were arrested, they would go on hunger strikes. The woman who threw herself under the horse of one of the king's guys on a race, right? They were radical. They were smashing windows. They were, putting dung in people's post boxes or whatever. They were just like crazy, stuff, especially for women to be doing at that time, right? And so there's a lot of anti-feminist propaganda about these manly women, and they're terrible mothers, and they, just want to go out and enjoy themselves. And
that's why they throw themselves under horses, right? They just want to have fun.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the thing is, though, if you only have a moderate group, then people won't pay attention because it won't be sort of in their face.
Right.
If you only have an extremist group, you have no one with which to negotiate. You have no moderates who can get the policy accomplishments that the groups ultimately want. Right? So in every political movement, you are going to have an extreme and a moderate wing, and how they kind of interact and go forward and deal with each other, I think can say a lot about a political movement.
Right.
But you can't really just have a political movement that doesn't push boundaries. Even the civil rights movement, which people look to and say, why can't Black Lives Matter be more like the civil rights movement? It seems like it was peaceful to us because we didn't live in a South where blacks were put in the back of the bus.
Right.
I don't know if you've seen the movie Hidden Figures.
Yep.
Oh my God, fabulous. Everyone it should be shown in schools.
No kidding, yeah.
And that was a brilliant movie because instead of talking about segregation and its dehumanizing effects, the way it humiliated people and demeaned them, it showed us. Yeah. It showed us the main character having to go 40 minutes to relieve herself because there was no place in that building that she could go because it was only for white people.
Right.
So we don't think sitting at a counter right now seems like an act of revolution.
Right.
But in the South in the 60s, for young black people to sit at a whites-only counter space and then be taunted and be spat on and have food and all of that aggression that they were causing, that was incredibly disruptive to the society at the time.
Right.
So, we tend to, I think, romanticize the civil rights movement, but people died. Mississippi Burning, if you've seen that movie, the history, there was a lot of violence, especially against the protesters,
right.
against the people who marched. And so, I don't know how you have not a revolution. I don't know how you advance on some of these social issues without an extreme and a moderate wing, because it seems to me every time we've had these problems, we've had both wings. So
right.
That was a really long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's a great answer, actually. It made me, because often in these discussions, when I'm online, I've had, people talk about civil rights, they talk about Martin Luther King, but they often forget the influence of somebody who, like Malcolm X.
Exactly.
And his more extreme version of things, and how that helped to influence the movement as a whole.
Yep.
It kind of brings up questions about like anti-fascist movements or Antifa now, and some of the actions that they take. I guess, what do you think of some of their more extreme actions? Does it just keep it in everybody's faces, or does it make it, does it hurt the movement at all?
Well, so I'm an American who's lived in Europe for, oh my God, almost 15 years now.
Oh, wow.
Right? And I've lived in the UK, and I currently live in Germany.
Okay.
So when it comes to fascism, the experience of Europeans is different from the experience of North Americans.
Right.
We didn't live under a fascist regime. We weren't threatened by fascist invasions, the fascist government invading and taking over our country. We didn't have a really strong and out fascist movement the way that you see in some European countries, since the after the 40s, 50s, 60s, especially the 70s and 80s, National Front, for instance. And so what I find is that my European friends are far more tolerant of the idea of punching Nazis.
Right.
Than my North American friends.
That's interesting.
My North American friends have the privilege of saying, look, I'm going to restrain from violence, even if someone has a rhetoric that's calling for a genocide or an ethnic cleansing, even a peaceful ethnic cleansing. They have their right to free speech.
Right.
But they've actually never lived under a government with that practice or been threatened with invasion by a government with that practice. So I'm not saying that I think it's right to punch Nazis. I enjoy that American privilege, that North American privilege of saying, I draw the line. Right. I draw the line at basically, where my nose ends is, I'm not going to go farther than that. It's going to be words. I'm not going to hit anybody, and I wouldn't condone hitting anybody. But I can respect the reactions of people who see fighting Nazis as a fight, not as a rhetorical fight.
Right, right.
But as a protection of democracy, protection of people's lives, of their property, of not being exported out into camps. When I walk along the streets of Cologne, they're called the stumbling stones.
Okay.
They're small brass plaques that are set into the sidewalk. Usually what would happen is, if you have an old street with cobblestone, a cobblestone size rock would be taken out, and this plaque is about the same size to be put into it.
Okay.
And on the name of the plaque is a person who lived at that address and was taken by the Nazis to a camp.
Oh, wow.
And if they know which camp they were sent to, that information is on there. If they died at that camp in a year, that death is on there. Occasionally, very rarely, I think I've seen one time where a person didn't die in the camps. But I will walk along the streets of Cologne, and I will see them dotted along the roads. Sometimes it's 1, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's a row of 9.
Oh, wow.
And that's a whole family.
Yeah.
And so I walk over ghosts every day. And so I understand that if people espousing the same views as those in the Third Reich, or advocating or accepting or promoting it, what people in this country went through, not just the victims, but also the civilians, the women and the children who lived in war-torn Germany because of the terrible decisions of their government, the destruction of the city that I now live in, what it was before it was bombed by the Allies, and what it could be now had these idiots not gone to war.
Right.
All of it. If punching some idiot, and that, I can understand why people would get that frustrated and say, no, this is a line.
Right.
This is a line I'm prepared to defend with violence. Again, I don't condone it, but I can understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, it seems like almost like like you say, like in North America, we look at it as a rhetorical or a philosophic difference where we can debate these ideas back and forth, and not everybody in the world has had that privilege, like you say.
Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of my European friends, they're going to say, let's debate this. But if these guys got in power, they'd say, let's round you up.
Right.
And you can't debate that.
Yeah.
How do you debate you're a Slav? I'm going to, I'm going to kick you out of the country, or I'm going to send you to prison. How do you don't debate that. Again, I'm just,
not
it sounds like
advocating.
this is my position. Yes, not advocating, but it's something I don't think a lot of North Americans think about.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think that people get really hung up on their own particular worldview, and they can't really often see past that. So
it took me living in Europe,
right,
and talking to people. So I can understand that.
Yeah. That kind of speaks to activism. And I wonder how activists and academia kind of play together in this movement of social justice.
Yeah, so there's this perception, it seems, that universities and university faculty are engaging in activism or promoting it or something.
Right.
I think what people who aren't attending those classes, because most of the time the people who are making these critiques aren't attending these classes, is that when you learn about something and it, like this, our recent conversation about the European attitudes toward fascism, it makes you think, right? And if you learn something that you find disturbing, it might move you to activism. So in the grassroots organizing training that I did when I was at university, there was a mantra: educate, agitate, organize. People can't get upset if they don't know what's going on. Right. So the first step is to make them aware of it. And that happens at universities. People get a much richer education. They are encouraged to make arguments. They are encouraged to look at things from different sides. They're presented with different theoretical accounts for the same phenomenon. And then they're asked to weigh them up. And maybe not pick their favorite, but just say this one's good because of this reason, but it's bad because of this reason. This one's good because of this reason, but it's deficient, and that process can then, especially for people who care about things like human rights and human dignity, inspire in them an agitation to solve problems. And then they join an organization. So there's kind of, as an academic, it's really quite important. The goals of an academic, at least, from all of the classes I've ever sat in, the goal that the person who's teaching the class walks in with is they want you to understand the material that covers the content of the course, and from a variety of perspectives, and to get you as a student to be able to critically evaluate the information and the theory. Sorry about the background noise. I'll close my mic. And so, you can teach Marx, and someone might have never really heard of the ideas in Marx and find that really interesting, and then go on to really like Marx, and then go through a Marxist phase, as many people do. And then some people stay in it. Other people move out of it.
Yeah.
I never went through a Marxist phase, but so, that doesn't mean that because they took that class, the class made them a Marxist.
Right.
Getting exposed to an idea doesn't make you something. And so, the point of the universities, I think, is to produce good citizens who can think critically, and have marketable skills. But that's like the third out of three things, for me. And campuses are a natural place for young people who do have radical ideas, because when you're younger, you're very idealistic. Yeah. You have very deep passions, right? And you haven't lived always long enough or had enough experiences to see the gray in life.
Right.
Right. And so these people are all living together. They're being exposed to new ideas. They're talking to each other. They see problems in the world, and then you get activism. So I think, if you had another institution, 2-year campuses are a little bit different because a lot of times students will commute. They don't live on the campuses. Right. But if you had communities of just, people who are only under the age of 25 living together, you would probably get, if for a different set of circumstances, like with music, you're going to get people who are going to be doing stuff about the arts and really caring about the arts. Right. So I think it's just a natural outgrowth of the factors that constitute a university setting.
I hear a lot about like some people are very concerned with the state of college campuses right now.
Yeah, I find it weird. I mean, let's just break this down, right? In the United States, there's like 330 million people.
Right.
And I don't know this, but I would be interested to find out what percentage of the population is between like the ages of 18 and 25, which are the prime ages for university, and are attending a 4-year university. Because in my home state of Wisconsin, only 30% of college or high school students who graduated went on to university.
Right.
And so I think, Madison had 40,000 at the time. Milwaukee had 20,000. Oshkosh had 10,000. I think one other campus had 10,000. The rest had 4,000 or 5,000. So you're talking in a state of 5 million people, about maybe 250,000 people total, and maybe that.
Right.
And their obsession with what happens around the lives of these two, this small fraction of the population, it's astounding to me in how disproportionate it is to reality.
Yeah, I wonder, like I have said to people before that it seems like they're really focusing on what's in the media, right? Mm-hmm. And the media reports what's extreme or what will get clicks. And I mean, nobody's talking about even the campuses that are totally peaceful all the time. And,
campuses where there are like no liberal students at all.
Right.
And they don't focus at all on the Christian universities.
Yeah.
Right? Not Liberty University or Oral Roberts University, none of that.
Yeah. Oddly enough, free speech isn't under attack at Liberty University.
Yeah, because here you have so many free speech rights. There was a campus which was basically it banned interracial dating until like the 1970s or 80s.
Jeez, right.
Yeah, one of them did. But there was actually Vox. The website just came out with some interesting. Now, I think it was a survey, so take it in terms of representative. I can't guarantee that, but they asked a bunch of people what they were, if they were getting involved in politics and all this stuff, and what they concluded based on their data was that of the people who were saying, yes, I'm calling my representative about what Donald Trump is doing or to oppose something, 80% of them were women.
Okay, wow.
And of that, most of them were middle-aged women, like me. Women who were like, well, I'm 45, but they were like 46 to 64. So all of these calls that you're hearing in the media, getting into the EPA when it denies climate change or flooding representatives, those are middle-aged women who are doing that. They're not on college campuses.
Huh.
The activism isn't really on the college campuses right now.
Wow.
It's, in houses all over the U.S., and so their obsession, their myopic concern about view of college campuses they're kind of ignoring the important, where the game is actually being played.
Right. So that's interesting.
Yeah, so Vox, I tweeted it out on Twitter, but just do Vox, and I think it was March 30th or 31st. It was just in the last couple of days.
Cool. Yeah, I'll definitely look that up. So I guess about college campuses, what do you think of the idea? Is it important for them to let controversial speakers speak, or like is it okay? Is it an attack on free speech for them to block out a Milo Yiannopoulos or whatnot, what have you?
Yeah, so here's my take, and this is my personal opinion because I don't make university policy.
Right.
I don't have a problem with controversial speakers who fit within the remit of the university, which is we teach, if it's a social issue that they're addressing, theory, we teach the presentation of empirical evidence, of how to draw conclusions based on evidence, the limitations and strength of a study. So if a person comes on and is controversial, but they're within that remit, then their ideas warrant being located within a university setting. If you've got Ken Ham coming and he's saying, look, I think what you really need to do is believe in Jesus. And once you believe in Jesus, you'll read the Bible and understand that creation, is only 6,000 years old.
Right.
This is not worthy of a university. And so, no, he shouldn't be, even if a student group invites him, if some Christian groups invites him on campus, there's nothing there that's intellectually,
right.
of meat,
it
were.
It's not educationally valuable.
Right. That's it. You don't just have somebody on because they're controversial.
Right.
You can have Bill Maher as an entertainer. You can have Ken Ham as an entertainer. But, having him on as entertainment is not the same as saying, speaking at
right.
the University of Minnesota as a serious guest speaker.
Yeah.
So.
I did a short debate with some people on the Wayward Atheist podcast, and I took the pro no platforming side. And my argument was that given the world that we live in, the universities have to make these decisions based on the economics of it, whether that includes money or reputation or what have you. They have to do a cost benefit analysis. And if it isn't worth having somebody there, then that's the decision they have to make. And that apparently didn't fly very well with some people. But
well, and there are business decisions. Milo, as his history shows, jacks up security costs.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, when he outed that student, a trans student, and basically put them at risk, I think that disqualifies him from ever being on a campus again.
Right, yeah.
Because if you're going to do anything to threaten student safety, you have no place on university campuses. But there's also the issue, because sometimes people try to conflate this and going, well, universities are a place to debate ideas, and you can't debate the ideas if they're not there. Right. But having Milo come and out a trans student and publicly shame her, I think it was, Yes, thank you. I don't want to misgender the person. He wasn't debating anyone.
Right.
He wasn't being challenged. He wasn't being asked to produce his sources or to provide, someone raises a counterpoint and he has to rebut it in a certain time period. He was just up there spewing. So that's another thing too. If Ken Ham wants to debate Bill Nye on a university campus, go for it.
Yeah.
Because that will be worthy of university content. But I can completely also see universities are not public institutions anywhere, well, not at least in the United States. I think when I was there, it was like 35 or 36% of the cost of instruction, and I'm sure, and that was in the 90s. So I'm sure University of Wisconsin system students are paying at least 40 to 45% of the cost of their instructions.
Right.
So this is not taxpayer funded; it's taxpayer supported.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
There's a difference.
Yeah.
So it's not like it's the government preventing your free speech.
No,
the students
right.
who pay have a say.
Yeah, I looked into that quite a bit for my debate, and it seems like there's no such thing as a school that isn't at least in some part funded by tuitions.
Yeah.
So there's still, no matter what, they're still subject to capitalism, right?
Yep.
They have to do a cost-benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, and if you're going to see your admission numbers go down because Milo is on your campus,
right,
you can't take that hit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's why Breitbart got rid of him. It's why Simon and Schuster dumped him.
Yeah, exactly.
He was a liability.
Yeah, it was no longer beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's not just about having random person here that's controversial for whatever purpose.
Yeah, none of us have an entitled right to go to any campus and demand to be given a platform and have, and advertise it and do it on their space. You can do that in a public park. You can get a permit. That's fine.
Right.
You can rent out the university's auditorium for a private function. That's fine. But, you can't force them to give you a platform.
Yeah, to say that I spoke at X university, yeah, it's a different thing. Actually, I wonder if you know something about speech codes. So far I haven't had... No? Okay.
In the UK, we never had to deal with those.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. And even with social science, we did political theory, but it's not like reading Mark Twain or reading more, it's not like literature. It's not like therapy, psychology or the things like that. It's, pretty straight up, history, theory, and quants and qual, So we don't need trigger warnings or... But insofar as I think that when I'm in the classroom, when I would teach, I would have a self-imposed speech code in terms of language I would use, and that is I tried to be inclusive. When I tried to give examples, I didn't always use like a straight white male, John and Jane. I tried to mix it up a little bit, and that's not because anyone was forcing me to. It's because I had a diverse group of students.
Right. So it seems reasonable to give diverse examples.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, it's something that a lot of people haven't really... That's one of those things that is out there, but not a lot of people actually know much about it.
Yeah, that doesn't stop them talking about it, though.
No, that's right. Yeah. So I guess, where do you think some of this pushback against social justice comes from?
There's always been pushback. The thing is that what you have now are a bunch of people, young people who are learning about it, and they think it's new. Right. And that sounds really kind of middle-aged to me, but it's true. When I listen to some of the people talk on YouTube, and they say, feminism really started to become a problem about 4 years ago. I'm like, well, that's because you started paying attention to it 4 years ago. Right. We talked about the suffragettes earlier. Right. There was massive pushback against women's right to vote. I mean, it only just passed. One representative, they were able to swing in the last state by one, they won it by one vote in the 37th state. And it was because his mother wrote him a letter and said, do the right thing. And he changed his mind. It literally it almost didn't happen. Right. The Equal Rights Amendment failed. There weren't enough states. So, there has always been pushback. The question is now they're part of the pushback. Right, right. That's the difference.
I wonder, I guess something I might have to look into is what are the similarities between the pushback against it then and now?
It's always been the same. Yeah. Women are complaining, if on the feminism side, women are complaining too much. Women who are active are called ugly. They're called manly. They're called, lesbians. They're accused of, wanting to be sexually libertines. They want to run around and have sex with everyone and have no consequences. Basically, what the pushback is, and it's not just from men, it comes from religious women especially too, but they criticize women who want to have the same liberties men have. But all of those things are turned and made perverted in a woman. To not want to have a kid or, to pursue a career. Right. Is considered perverted.
Suddenly to want selfish.
To have yes to want to have a lot of sex or have sex with a lot of different people to see what it's like. Right. You're a slut. There's no male equivalent. There's kind of dog, which comes from the African American community in the States, and from what I can see, but that's about he's a dog. And he'll hump anything.
Quite often that's a positive from the male perspective.
Yeah.
It's
right.
It's not
what's up, dog?
It's not looked at the same way.
What's up, my dog? Yeah. And so that pushback has always been there. It just takes different forms depending on what the women are arguing for. So primarily, in the legal sphere, women were told that politics is too dirty in the first wave, and that women should stay indoors and politics is no place for them, and against the vote. Then you had, in the 1960s and 70s, women wanted sexual liberation, right? So the pill became available. Contraception in the United States with the Griswold decision became available to more than just married couples for the first time. Okay. Abortion became legal. Yeah. No-fault divorce was passed in every state, which I saw a fascinating study that showed that if they analyzed death rates or something, you can find the paper, but what they found was that after a state instituted no-fault divorce, women's suicide rates declined.
I think I heard that somewhere, yeah.
Yes. So no-fault divorce. So suddenly women wanted to earn the same money as men. They wanted to pursue high-paying careers. They wanted to put off having children. They wanted to have a lot of sex.
Right.
And all of this was, there's the Pat Robertson, feminism turns women into witches and makes them lesbians who want to kill their children.
Right.
And now today it's the same thing. It's just a different form because we're talking about intersectionality and the multiple ways in which oppressions can work, and also the kind of other self-criticism that's going on within feminism about trans issues and people who are trans exclusionary and those who, like me, are trans inclusionary. But the same kinds of things about women have it good enough. They're just whining for more now,
right.
And they're ugly. They couldn't get laid. Think of Carl Sargon-of-Akkad's "I wouldn't even rape you" comment to MP Jess Phillips on Twitter. That was retweeted at her 600 times.
Wow. And
people were talking about whether or not they would even rape her. So it's still going. That's kind of sexual menace.
That's the kind of thing that makes you wonder why people how they can't see the need for a feminist movement.
Yes. He's saying feminism cancer. I'm like, no, you're the reason we need feminism, Carl.
That's right.
Like tweets like that are why we need feminism, because you wouldn't say that to a man.
Yeah, exactly.
You're using rape because she's a woman and you're a man, and you want to show that you could potentially sexually humiliate and dominate her, and you want to remind her of that.
Yeah.
And that's why we need feminism, because you think that that's an option in terms of how to treat somebody.
Yeah. So I guess, what is even third wave feminism? Like, is this something
right? Yeah. Fair enough. It's a fair enough question. Sure. So first wave feminism is pretty much described as the public sphere. So when I talked about the social before, and the economic and the civil, the legal, the political sphere, the religious sphere, another way we can kind of group society is into our public lives and our private lives.
Okay.
What we do outside the house and inside the house. First wave feminism was really focused on outside the house kind of issues. How women are in society, especially with regard to the state. Will the state recognize them as legal individuals separate from their husbands? Do they have the right, when they earn money, to keep it? Because before when women earned money, it was her husband's property.
Right.
So they're having the right to access higher education, having the right to employment, having the right to vote. These were all outside the house kinds of issues. Second wave feminism, you can loosely, because obviously there's a lot of crossover. Women are still working for legal rights in the second wave, abortion rights and things in the public sphere. But the second wave, the transformation that happened there was this idea that the personal is political. So if there is domestic violence going on in the house, that's not a private matter, that's a public problem.
Right.
Right. Mothers Against Drink Driving, in a lot of ways, is second wave feminism. It's taking something that previously was considered just a vehicle accident, and changing drunk driving into something that's really irresponsible and beyond the pale. And it was Moms Against Drunk Drivers. That kind of taking on the issue of mothers who had lost children because of people getting behind the wheel intoxicated. That lent it kind of a moral weight, but it was a personal issue. But it had a public policy ramifications. Then there are things like reproductive access. And women had started to enter employment, but they were stuck. They were secretaries, they weren't the directors. They were the nurses, they weren't the doctors. They were the legal aides, not the lawyers. And women wanted to push through those barriers. So second wave feminism was really about those sets of issues. Now, the thing about, we're sort of talking about these things, and reflecting back now after I described third wave feminism, you're going to notice that they're primarily the concerns of middle class and upper class white women who wanted access to education, who wanted divorce rights, who wanted to keep what money they earned or what money they brought into the marriage. Same thing, too, with a lot of the second wave issues. It was still very much from the position of a privileged white woman who was basically worried about sexual discrimination at work and things like that, but didn't have to deal with racial issues on top of sexist issues, or being disabled on top of being a woman or being lesbian.
Okay.
That wasn't really part of it. Now, to its credit, the National Organization of Women in the 1970s did start to articulate for lesbian women. They sort of adopted a platform and made an explicit commitment to women who are lesbians as equal members of the women's movement, in their women's movement. But critiques of that kind of very singular focus came from, well, it wasn't, there was critiques going back, it's not like black women just kind of woke up and went, hey, you know what?
Right.
But I guess maybe it was a ripe time or there was a generation ready to hear it, but there were voices that bell hooks and other important thinkers came up and started to say, hey, you know what? It's not just enough to be working on civil rights and working on feminism. We have to understand how black women's experiences are shaped equally
Right.
by many things, but both by being black and by being a woman. And I can't as a white woman speak to that experience. I have to give, I don't have to give, but that person has to have space to speak to her experiences and how she is experiencing things, and what solutions there could be.
Right.
And I have to listen. And so third wave feminism is trying to understand, here let me describe it this way. In quantitative analysis, we have what's called an interaction effect. It's a way that we mathematically determine when, let's say you have sex and age, on people's propensity to vote. We know that women vote, like in the UK, women vote at a slightly higher rate than men. And we know that older people vote at a higher rate than younger people. So what we do is we take age and we take sex, but then we take age and sex and we multiply them to get a very special, to get a specific number. And that number is the effect of both being old and being, let's say you have age and one is coded as woman. So the age of effect on being a woman as opposed to being a man, getting older. And so you get the age effect and the sex effect, but then you get an extra measurement that allows you to calculate how much being older and being a woman makes you to vote compared to being older and being a man or being younger and being a man. So you need the interaction effect to capture the full variation, to get the full story.
Right.
And it's the same thing with intersectionality. You can't just look at race and sex as if they're separate. You also have to be able to kind of multiply them, that extra bit together for the extra information that comes from the two of them interacting. And that's being expanded. It's LGBT in the 1970s is sort of the first part of it. But then you've got issues of disability, you've got trans issues, you've got class issues, you've got age issues, you've got ethnicity, status. Women who are undocumented workers,
Right.
if they experience certain types of sexual violence and can't go to the police because they're afraid of being deported, you're basically letting these predators get away with targeting and abusing women who are vulnerable. So you have to look at her whole experience that's so different from my experience. If I was assaulted, I would report it to the police.
Right.
It wouldn't even occur to me not to.
Right. That's
right. But is she going to be believed?
Right.
Are the police going to take her seriously, or is she just going to get deported? What's going to happen to her family? Yeah, so that's what intersectionality allows us to do. And actually, because I was thinking about it, the way that intersectional feminism actually can bring men and men's issues to the fore. I was talking earlier about the personal being political.
Right.
And in the 1970s, let's just take the issue of domestic violence. Because women were becoming politicized about things happening inside the home, before that, domestic violence and abuse wasn't really a societal issue. If you remember back, Jackie Gleason, I think it was, used to have this punchline for the honeymooners.
Pow zoom, straight to the moon.
Exactly. He was joking about punching her in the face.
Yeah.
And that was considered, people laughed. It was the hit quote from the show. It's the thing we remember. Right? You couldn't have that today, in part because of the work that was done to raise awareness of domestic violence.
Right.
Now, because it was women doing it, because it was their experiences, and they were the voices speaking for it, it was gendered, and that was focused more on women's experiences. In this case, solely on women's experiences.
Right.
But raising the issue of domestic violence and publishing information on what an abuser is like and the signs of abuse made men who were abused, it gave them that information. It raised the awareness. And for some of those men, they would say, well, I'm being abused. Who's there to help me?
Right.
So I think that is how intersectionality can help men in terms of feminism. Issues like rape in prison.
Right.
Issues where, younger boys who are 14 or 15 who are sexually abused by an older woman, people will say, oh, he's lucky. I would have loved to screw my teacher when I was 15. He was raped. He couldn't consent.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't tolerate that.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't tolerate that it was a 15-year-old girl and a 37-year-old man.
Exactly.
Right. So it's, feminism kind of brings the issue up, and then we can intersectionally bring men in there to see in men who are victims but are invisible because of patriarchal norms about being strong and tough and not being beaten up by a woman or not being raped, things like that.
No, I think you said that quite well. I've had a lot of these discussions with people, and I don't use the word patriarchy. What I always try to say is traditional gender roles, right? Yeah, exactly. Because apparently
it's triggering.
Yeah,
they need a trigger warning.
is triggering.
Trigger warning.
That's right.
Patriarchy, problematic. We'll just put up a whole bunch of words that safe space.
That's right. I really appreciate your time. I feel like we could talk for another hour, but I do have to get going.
Of course.
I'll ask you a couple questions to finish off, and then I'll get you to plug your stuff.
Okay.
First, what is something that you wish everyone would realize about social justice?
You want to get going, and now I feel pressure to give an answer. But that's a really deep question.
Yeah, I suppose, eh?
Yeah. I think what I see, it really comes down to the golden rule. So many of the things that when people are complaining about Black Lives Matter, they're complaining about a safe space on a university campus. What they're not doing is walking in the shoes of the person who is the person who needs that safe space.
Right.
Or the other thing. They're only looking at it from the outside. And so I wish that everyone would realize that your experience of justice is your experience of justice. And when other people talk about their experiences of injustice, just try listening to them.
Right.
And looking at it from their point of view and realize if you can see where they're coming from. Can you get that far? I would be really happy if people just tried to get that far.
Right. Just to listen, hey?
Yeah. Less talky, more listen.
If you had to criticize your own side of things, the pro-social justice side of things, what would be a criticism of that? I think it's kind of like Clinton versus Trump in that I see the other side that's, sort of euphemistically called the rationals, actually being incredibly emotive and using very emotive language and framing things in a way that's confrontational and designed to create outrage and generate more emotions. Right.
And we use really academic terms and we define things well and, we try to go through and be very rigorous. And I think what, the YouTube community is doing better and better is trying to not speak in a very base way to people, but trying to bring complicated ideas down into a simple language. Right. I think the more we can do that, the more we can speak to people on their level. Sometimes you need academic language. I have a hard time not speaking in academic language.
Right.
But
I suppose that's a burden from actually having an education.
Yes. Yes. So I think if we can, maybe like what you said before, instead of saying patriarchy, use an alternative word like traditional gender norms. Find ways around the trigger words.
Right.
And the hard thing is, then they'll start getting triggered at traditional gender norms. It'll just become,
true, yeah.
It'll go like from Negro to colored to, black to, how a word
no matter
becomes
where you go, it's suddenly
Yeah, because it's the same thing that's the cause and the problem. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe that's about the best. I'm sure there are people who are extreme out there, but the people I know are people in the YouTube community are just genuinely good people, and it's more a fault of me really in terms of academic speak than any of them. So really, what I'm saying is, what could you do better, Kristi? And that's more fair, self-reflective. So fair. I shouldn't project it out onto everyone else.
No, that's fair. I've quite often I've had to frame that question because of the way the conversation went. I've had to say, what would you say to criticize yourself type thing to some people. So, so that's fair.
Yeah. Okay.
So I guess, where can people find your stuff?
My channel is Kristi Winters with a K and an I. It was fashionable for about 5 minutes in the 1970s when I was born. So Kristi Winters, the last name is easy. I do lots of stuff. I do lots of stuff on politics and feminism, and I do some stuff on social science, and I occasionally take the mickey out of anti-feminists. So if all of that or any of it sounds interesting, please come over to YouTube and check out some of my content. I would be happy to see you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I had a blast.
Yeah, I think I may focus on feminism in a future project, but so I might come back to you for some of these. Yeah, it'd be
great. Well, if you ever need a recommendation, just let me know, because I had a fab time.
Right on. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so that was my interview with Kristi Winters, Dr. Kristi Winters. More of a conversation, really. I had some questions, but we kind of just talked. Something I thought that was particularly noteworthy was actually something that happened before we set up our interview. I sent Kristi a copy of my notes and some of the questions that I needed answered, and her instinct after I sent them to her was to ask me how educated I was on feminism or sociology, or the subjects we talked about surrounding social justice, because the questions that I had sounded like they were from someone who didn't know much about the subjects. I thought this was a bit telling, because that's often what these discussions are. Someone who is well educated in a particular field trying to fill in someone who isn't educated but has some pretty major false assumptions about it. I think we stuck to pretty well-known things in this conversation, except for one survey regarding who was doing the activism and calling their representatives post-Trump election. I found an article that talked about that, and we'll provide that link in the show notes. You can find more content from Dr. Kristi Winters on YouTube at youtube.com/user/drkmwinters. I'll give a couple other links in the show notes so that you can follow her on Twitter and like her Facebook page. I also want to mention that Thomas Smith recently had Kristi on his show, Serious Inquiries Only, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. They go into detail about her background, some of her activism, and they discuss the MythCon issues and the tweet from Carl Benjamin that I mentioned in the introduction. It's an amazing episode and well worth the listen. Before I close things out, I want to also let you know about our new conference project. I know I mentioned it in the intro as well. My co-host on Brainstorm, Angela, the Shift to Reason planning team, and I have started a GoFundMe with a goal of $5,000. This money will pay for nearly everything for our conference, and donations will go towards the purchase of your ticket. And, of course, they'll be greatly appreciated as well. We're committed to doing a positive, skeptical conference with a pro-social justice spin, featuring a diversity of speakers from various backgrounds, a few controversial topics between social justice and skepticism, and a harassment-free environment. You can support the upcoming Shift to Reason conference at gofundme.com/Shift to Reason Conference 2018 with dashes in between all those. As for anything else, you can email me at mail@brainstormblog.net. You can find more of these episodes at Spreaker.com/show/thehardcoreskepticexamines. You can find me on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and just about anywhere else you find podcasts. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at Hardcore Skeptic and like my Facebook page, facebook.com/Hardcore Skeptic. If you want to support my work, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Hardcore Skeptic. I would need to give a huge thanks to all my patrons, Larry Wilson, as well as Chris Watson of the Podunk Polymath podcast, Marissa Alexa McCool of the Inciting Incident podcast, and Trav Mamone of the By Any Means podcast. Remember to check out my other show, The Brainstorm Podcast. You can find that at thebrainstormpodcast.com or brainstormblog.net. Music for this episode is actually Sequoia Throne by Protest the Hero and is used under the SOCAN license to play. Thanks for listening, and remember, the truth matters. It seems like you're really, I guess, where was I going with this?
So I'm sorry, I've kind of lost a little bit of the thread. What was the question?
It was just how do different groups fit into social justice?
Right.
I kind of forgot where we started.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. See, this is having such a good conversation in the interview. Yeah. This was on anti-fascists and my position on punching Nazis.